You know they have a name for what I am. A gray ghost. That's what the bank manager called me with a wink when we signed the final papers. A spirit, already dead to his family, just waiting to stop moving. A walking, breathing obstacle between them and what they believed was rightfully theirs. I should have known the moment the phone calls changed. It wasn't, "Hey, Pop, how's the back?" anymore. It became, "Hi, Dad, just checking in. You're still getting the roof inspected, right? We don't want any water damage eating away at the equity." The equity. Such a cold, hungry word. It slithered out of my son-in-law Mark's mouth like a snake, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in my old study. My daughter Sarah, my little girl, she was subtler, but the greed was there, shining in her eyes every Sunday visit. She'd run her hand over the mahogany banister I'd built with my own father, and she wouldn't see the memory of us sanding it together. She'd see a future antique in her foyer. She'd look at the family portrait hanging in the hall, and her gaze would skip right over my late wife Alina's smile, my own younger face, and settle on the value of the gilded frame. I felt like a museum curator for a collection I was never meant to own, just mined until the true heirs were ready to take possession. And then came the night, the one that shattered the last fragile pane of glass my love for them was clinging to. They thought I was asleep in my armchair, the TV droning some old western. The sound of their hushed, urgent voices from the kitchen was what pulled me from my doze. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but sometimes the universe puts a truth right in your path, and you can either stumble over it or pick it up. I picked it up. I crept closer, the old floorboards knowing to stay silent under my slippers. "It's just a matter of time, Sarah," Mark was saying, his voice a low, impatient rumble. "We need to be prepared. The market is peaking. This house is a gold mine." "I know, Mark, but he's still here." "It's his home," Sarah replied, but her voice was weak, wavering. It was the voice she used when she was about to give in to him. "It's an asset," Mark corrected, and I could hear the slap of his hand on the kitchen table. "A dormant one. My God, the property taxes alone are a fortune he's barely covering. It's irresponsible. When he's gone, we sell. We split the proceeds with your brother and we buy the lake house. It's a simple plan. Kyle's already on board." Kyle, my son, my boy. My heart squeezed in my chest, a painful, hollow thud. "Is he?" Sarah asked, a hint of surprise in her tone. "Of course he is. He's got his eyes on that new sports car dealership. He called this place his startup capital. His words, not mine." I felt my knees go weak. I had to lean against the wall, the cool plaster a stark reality against my back. Startup capital. My home. The place where I'd brought Alina as a bride, where we'd raised our children, where I'd held her hand as she took her last, ragged breath. It had been reduced to capital, a line item in their avaricious little futures. Mark's voice dropped even lower, conspiratorial, venomous. "Look, the old man's had a good run. He's comfortable, but he's living in the past. We have to think about the future, our future. It's not like he's doing anything with it. He's just sitting here, waiting to die." The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. It was the sound of my daughter's complicity. It was the sound of my own heart sealing itself shut. In that moment, something in me broke, and something else, something hard and cold and brilliantly clear, was forged in its place. They thought I was just sitting here, waiting to die. But I was wrong, dead wrong. The next morning I made a phone call, not to a friend, not to a lawyer, to the number on the glossy brochure I'd been getting in the mail for years, the one I'd always thrown directly into the recycling bin with a grimace of disgust. The one with the smiling, silver-haired couples on the front, strolling along a beach. "Unlock your home's potential," the headline screamed. "Live your golden years in style." "Hello," I said, my voice steady, a plan crystallizing in my mind with every word. "I'd like to speak to someone about a reverse mortgage." The man who came to see me was young, crisp in a suit that cost more than my first car. His name was David, and he treated me with a kind of polite, professional condescension that I used to find irritating. That day, I found it useful. He saw a frail, old man in a dusty house, a easy commission. He didn't see a strategist. He didn't see a man plotting the last and greatest performance of his life. We sat at the very same kitchen table where my fate had been discussed the night before. David spread out his charts and graphs. The beauty of the product, Mr. Kobe, is that you get to stay in your home for the rest of your life. You pay nothing back. The bank simply assumes ownership upon the eventual sale of the property. Upon my death, I said bluntly, watching him flinch. You can say it. I'm not afraid of the word. Yes, sir. Upon your passing, the estate, your heirs, would then have the option to pay off the accumulated loan balance with interest to retain the property, or the bank sells it to satisfy the debt. I nodded slowly, as if digesting this complex information. And the amount, how much can I unlock? He tapped a number into his calculator, consulted a database on his tablet. He named a figure. It was astronomical. More money than I had ever seen in my life. More money than Alina and I had ever dreamed of. It was the entire, glorious, terrifying equity, the very number my children were so salivating over. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't quaver. I looked him dead in the eye. I'll take it all. David blinked. Sir, that's a significant sum. Most clients choose a monthly payment plan to supplement their income. I don't want a supplement, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. I want the entire amount, in a lump sum, as soon as humanly possible. He stared at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, not condescension, but a dawning professional curiosity. May I ask, what for? I leaned back in my chair, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has just discovered a secret weapon. Experiences, David, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm investing in experiences. The process was a whirlwind of paperwork, home appraisals, and legal signatures. I told my family I was doing some estate planning, a little financial shuffling to make things easier for them later. They ate it up. Mark even clapped me on the back. Smart move, Kobe. Getting your affairs in order. Very responsible. The day the money hit my account, I felt a jolt, not of joy, but of pure, unadulterated power. It was a corrosive, dangerous feeling, and I embraced it like a long-lost lover. This was my revenge, my justice, served not cold but lavishly, spectacularly. My first purchase was a ticket, not just any ticket, a first-class lie-flat seat to Paris. Alina had always dreamed of Paris. We'd saved for years, but then the kids came and braces and college tuition, and the dream got boxed up and put in the attic with all the other might-have-beens. I booked a suite at the Ritz, overlooking the Place Vendôme. I remember walking into that hotel, my one decent suit and a carry-on bag, feeling every one of my 78 years. The concierge looked at me, this old American man alone, and I saw the same polite dismissal I'd seen in David's eyes. Then I gave him my name. His demeanor shifted instantly. Respect, real respect, flowed from him. They knew about the suite. They knew about the champagne I'd ordered in advance. That night I stood on the balcony, a glass of vintage Krug in my hand, watching the lights of the city sparkle. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt sad that Alina wasn't by my side. But all I felt was a fierce, burning vindication. I was using their inheritance. I was spending their future. And it was the most alive I'd felt in a decade. I hired a private car and a guide, a sharp-witted art student named Claudette, and I had her take me to the Louvre. But I didn't want to fight the crowds for a glimpse of the Mona Lisa. I paid an exorbitant fee for a private, after-hours tour. We stood alone in the silent, vast hall of the Italian masters. The guard stood discreetly in the corner as I gazed at Titians and Caravaggios, the only sound the echo of our footsteps. It is magnificent, no, Claudette whispered, her voice full of awe. It's quiet, I replied. That's what I paid for, the quiet. I was buying back the silence that their greedy whispers had stolen from me. Every euro I spent was a brick I was pulling from the foundation of the future they had so carefully, so callously, built for themselves on the grave of my home. I flew from Paris to Venice. I rode in a gondola, not with a lover, but with a trio of musicians I hired to play Vivaldi as we glided through the canals at sunset. I went to Kyoto during cherry blossom season, staying in a ryokan where I slept on a tatami mat and soaked in a hot spring, watching the pink petals drift down like snow. I felt a leaner with me on every trip. I'd talk to her, tell her about the sights, and in the quiet moments I could almost feel her disapproval warring with her wonder. "Oh, Kobe," she seemed to say on the wind in Kyoto, "what have you done?" "I'm living, Ellie," I whispered back to the blossoms. "Finally, I'm living." Meanwhile, back home, the charade continued. The Sunday visits became a theater of the absurd. They'd come over, and I'd serve them store-bought cookies, my secret millions stashed in accounts they knew nothing about. "The garden's looking a bit wild, Dad," Kyle mentioned one afternoon, his tone light, but his eyes critically scanning the overgrown rose bushes. "You want me to get a landscaper in here, protect the curb appeal." Curb appeal, another one of their words. I just smiled, a bland, gentle smile. "It's fine, son, the birds like it this way." Sarah started bringing over paint samples. "Just thinking ahead, Dad. This seafoam serenity would really brighten up the living room, make it feel more modern for the next owners." The next owners. My blood ran cold, but I kept the smile plastered on my face. "It's a lovely color, sweetheart, we'll see." I was a ghost in my own home, watching them plan its renovation for a future that would never come. The irony was so thick I could taste it, metallic and sweet, like blood in my mouth. I began to document my travels, not with photos I'd share, but in a beautiful leather-bound journal I bought in Florence. I wrote down every detail, the taste of the wine, the sound of the music, the feeling of the sun on my face in the Sahara Desert where I rode a camel to a Bedouin camp. This journal was my testament, my proof that I hadn't just squandered the money. I had transformed it. I had converted their cold, hard equity into memories, into sunsets, into moments of breathtaking beauty. It was my argument for the defense, should I ever need to make one. The spending was reckless, glorious, and utterly deliberate. I didn't buy things. I bought moments. I paid a fortune to have a world-renowned chef, a man who had 3 Michelin stars, fly to my rented villa in Tuscany and cook a private dinner for one. I sat at a long table set for 20 with just one place setting at the head. I ate 7 perfect courses, each one a masterpiece, while the staff stood by, attentive and silent. The loneliness was a physical presence in the other 19 chairs, but it was a loneliness of my own choosing, a king's solitude, not the loneliness of a forgotten old man. A year into my secret life, the first crack appeared. Mark, ever the financial watchdog, noticed something. "Dad," he said one Sunday, his tone carefully neutral, "I was helping you sort your mail, and I couldn't help but notice a statement from First National. I didn't know you had an account there." I felt a jolt of ice in my veins, but my face remained a placid mask. The statement was for a secondary account. I used to pay the property taxes and utilities, funded by a small portion of the reverse mortgage money. I'd been careless. "Oh, that," I waved a dismissive hand. "Just a small savings account I've had for years, for emergencies." He looked at me, his eyes narrow, calculating. The activity seemed recent, and the balance was quite healthy. "I've been fortunate with some investments," I said, the lie smooth as silk on my tongue. It was technically true. The house had been my investment. He didn't press further, but a new wariness entered his eyes. The vulture had sensed a shift in the wind. The corpse was moving. After that, I became more careful. I switched everything to paperless statements. I bought a shredder. The game was getting more dangerous. The tension in the house was a palpable thing. Their visits became more frequent, more probing. They were like archaeologists, gently brushing away the dust, looking for the tomb of my secrets. I started to feel the walls closing in. The lavish trips were no longer just about revenge or experience. They became escapes, necessary respites from the pressure of their suspicion. I decided on one last grand adventure. The one Alina and I had fantasized about most, an African safari. I booked the most exclusive, luxurious tour available, a private guided journey through the Serengeti, staying in tented camps that were fancier than any five-star hotel I'd ever been in. The night before I left, I had them all over for dinner: Sarah, Mark, and Kyle. It was a strained affair. Kyle was distracted, constantly checking his phone, no doubt looking at sports car catalogs. Mark was quiet, watching me. Sarah tried to keep the conversation light, talking about her book club. I looked at them, my family, these strangers who wore the faces of my children. I felt a profound, gut-wrenching sadness beneath the steely resolve. This was the Last Supper. Not my last, but the last one before the final act. I knew the return from this trip would be the beginning of the end. "You're looking well, Dad," Sarah said, a note of genuine, if confused, affection in her voice. "You seem lighter somehow." "I am, sweetheart," I said, and I meant it. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about life, about what's important." Mark's head snapped up. "Oh, anything you want to share." I met his gaze, holding it for a beat too long. "Not yet, but soon, very soon." The silence that fell was heavy, charged with unspoken questions and a growing dread. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know it was an avalanche. The next morning, I left for the airport. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the house. The white colonial with the black shutters, the home we'd built a life in. It stood there, serene and beautiful, a monument to a life that was already over. It was no longer my home. It was the bank's house, and I was its gray ghost, finally flying away. The safari was everything I dreamed it would be and more. The sheer, raw scale of the landscape, the thunder of a wildebeest migration, the silent, deadly grace of a leopard in a tree. It put things in perspective. My little family drama, my revenge plot, it all felt both terribly insignificant and monumentally important under that vast African sky. I was sitting by the campfire on my last night, sipping a fine scotch, listening to the sounds of the wilderness when my satellite phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from home. A cold dread trickled down my spine. I answered. It was my neighbor, Frank. His voice was tense, urgent. "Kobe, thank God, there's been an incident. It's Mark. He broke into your house." The world tilted. The glass of scotch froze halfway to my lips. "What?" "He called a locksmith, Kobe. Told him he'd lost his keys. Sarah was with him. They've been in there for hours. I saw them carrying out boxes. I didn't know what to do, so I called you." They had finally stopped waiting. The vultures weren't just circling anymore. They had landed and were tearing at the flesh. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury, so hot and bright it blinded me for a second. They had crossed a line. They had violated the last sacred space. My hands were shaking, but my voice was dangerously calm. "Frank," I said, "listen to me very carefully. Don't do anything. Don't call the police. Not yet." "But Kobe there." "I know what they're doing," I cut him off, the plan finalizing in my mind with crystal clarity. Let them have their little treasure hunt." I ended the call and stared into the fire, the flames reflecting the inferno raging inside me. The game was over. The performance was coming to a close. It was time for the curtain to fall. I had one last part to play, the grand finale, and I knew with a chilling certainty that when I walked back through that front door, all hell was going to break loose. The flight home was the longest 18 hours of my life. It wasn't the cramped seat in economy. I'd flown back commercial. The first-class fairy tale was over, the money nearly gone. No, it was the cage of my own thoughts. Frank had sent me a single, grainy photo from his phone, taken through my living room window. It showed Mark, his back to the camera, holding a sheaf of papers, my papers, from my desk drawer. The drawer I kept locked. They hadn't just broken into my house. They'd picked the lock on my private things. The violation was a physical sickness in my gut. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the seat back in front of me, watching the little plane icon crawl across the map, inching its way toward the explosion I knew was waiting. All the serenity I'd bought, all the peace from the safari, it evaporated at 30,000 feet, replaced by a cold, hard knot of anticipation. This was it, the end game. The taxi ride from the airport was like a procession to my own execution. I didn't go home straight away. I had the driver stop at Alina's grave. I needed to talk to her to steady myself. The headstone was cool under my hand. Alina Marie Kobe, beloved wife and mother. "They've done it, Ellie," I whispered, the wind whipping my coat around my legs. "They've finally torn the door down. I don't know if what I've done is justice or madness. I only know I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them turn our life into a transaction." I waited, hopping for a sign, for a feeling of her warmth, her guidance. All I felt was the cold granite and a profound, aching loneliness. I was truly on my own now. When the taxi finally pulled up to the house, it looked the same, deceptively peaceful. The white paint, the black shutters, the rose bushes I'd let run wild. But it felt different. It felt contaminated. I paid the driver, took a deep, shuddering breath, and walked up the path. I didn't need my key. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the silence. It wasn't the quiet of an empty house. It was the thick, heavy silence after a battle. The living room was a disaster zone. Books were pulled from the shelves and lay in piles on the floor. Desk drawers hung open, their contents, pens, paper clips, old receipts, spilled out like entrails. The antique globe I'd loved, the one Alina gave me for our 40th anniversary, was tilted on its axis, its surface scarred. And they were all there, waiting for me. Sarah was perched on the edge of the sofa, her face pale and streaked with tears, wringing a tissue into shreds in her lap. Kyle was packing by the fireplace, a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching. And Mark stood behind my own desk, like a general who had captured enemy headquarters. Spread out on the leather blotter in front of him were the documents. The thick, legal-sized documents from the bank. The reverse mortgage agreement. The air was so thick, with tension you could have cut it with a knife. For a long moment, no one spoke. We just looked at each other, a frozen tableau of familial collapse. It was Mark who broke the silence. He didn't shout. His voice was low, venomous, dripping with a contempt, so profound it made the hair on my arm stand up. He picked up the topmost document, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something filthy. "What," he said, the word a sharp, precise dart, "is this?" I didn't answer. I slowly took off my coat, draped it over the back of the armchair, and sat down. I made a show of getting comfortable, crossing my legs, trying to still the frantic beating of my heart. I was the gray ghost, back from the dead, and I would not be rushed. "We asked you a question, old man," Kyle snarled, stopping his packing to glare at me. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot. This was the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the young man I'd hugged at his college graduation. Now he looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. "Kyle, don't," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Don't. Sarah, have you even looked at this?" Mark slammed the paper down on the desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "He's taken out a reverse mortgage. A reverse mortgage. For the entire goddamn value of the house." Sarah flinched as if he'd struck her. She looked at me, her eyes begging me to deny it, to explain it all away. "Dad, is that true?" I met her gaze, I held it, and I gave one slow, deliberate nod. The sound that came out of her was a strangled sob. She buried her face in her hands. "Why?" The word was ripped from Kyle's throat. He took a step toward me, his body vibrating with rage. "Why would you do that? You've thrown it all away. You've stolen from us." That was the word I'd been waiting for, the word that justified everything. I uncrossed my legs and leaned forward, my own anger, so long suppressed, finally finding its voice. It was calm, it was cold, and it was sharper than any of Kyle's shouts. "Stolen," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Stolen from you. This is my house, Kyle. I built the life in it. I paid for every brick, every nail with my sweat, with my life, with my time with your mother. What precisely did I steal from you? An expectation, a fantasy you built on the back of my labor. My words stunned them into silence. Even Mark looked taken aback by the force of it. It was our inheritance, Kyle yelled, throwing his arms out wide. Mom would have wanted us to have it. This was her home too. Don't you dare, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Don't you dare use your mother's name to justify your greed. Your mother would be ashamed of you, ashamed of what you've become. Sarah cried out, a fresh wave of tears shaking her shoulders. Where is it? Mark demanded, cutting through the emotion like a shark. He was the pragmatist, the accountant. The money was the only thing that mattered. The money, the lump sum payout, it's not in any of your accounts we could find. What did you do with it? Did you give it to some charity, some scam artist? Did you invest it in some idiotic scheme? A slow, bitter smile touched my lips. This was the moment, the revelation. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out my journal. The beautiful, soft leather was worn now, covered in a fine layer of dust from the Serengeti. I placed it on the coffee table with a soft thud. I invested it in an experience, Mark, I said quietly. They all stared at the unassuming book. What is that? Kyle asked, his voice thick with confusion and rage. That, I said, is your inheritance. Kyle let out a bark of disbelieving laughter. A notebook. You spent our future on a fucking notebook. Language, Kyle, I said, my tone dangerously mild. Open it. He hesitated, then stomped over, snatched it up, and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His face, once flushed with anger, began to pale. He saw the dates. The entries. September 14th, Paris, suite at the Ritz. Champagne tasted like liquid gold, thought of Ellie all night, wished she were here but felt her with me in the quiet. Spent the day walking along the Seine, bought this journal, cost more than my first suit. October 22nd, Venice, hired a gondola and a trio for Vivaldi. The water was black silk, the music echoed off the ancient stones, a young couple on a bridge waved. They thought I was a romantic, I was just a spender. March 3rd, Kyoto. The cherry blossoms are a blizzard of pink. Sat in silence for 3 hours in the garden of the Ryokan. A peace I haven't known since before Ellie died. Bought a tiny, useless porcelain cup for $100. Drank sake from it. It was perfect. Kyle's hands began to shake. He flipped through the pages, his eyes widening in horror and disbelief. He saw the entry about the private dinner in Tuscany, about the Michelin-starred chef, about the safari. No, he whispered. No, this is a lie. This is a story you made up. It's all true, I said, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The truth was out. The weight was lifting from my shoulders and settling squarely onto theirs. Every last cent. I converted your asset into memories. I turned your equity into sunsets. I traded your startup capital for silence and beauty. I lived children. While you were waiting for me to die, I was living a life you can't even imagine. The room was utterly silent, save for Sarah, ragged breathing. Mark came out from behind the desk. He moved slowly, deliberately. He took the journal from Kyle's limp hands. He read a page, then another. His face was a stone mask, but a muscle in his jaw twitched violently. He looked from the journal to me, and in his eyes I saw not just anger, but a dawning, horrified respect. He was a man who understood numbers, who understood transactions. And he understood in that moment the brilliant, devastating transaction I had executed. You monstrous, selfish bastard, he breathed, the words barely audible. Selfish? I laughed, a dry, hollow sound. You call me selfish? You who mapped out my death for your profit. You who talked about curb appeal over my still warm body. I was a ghost in this house, and you were the haunters. I just decided to spend my hauntings elsewhere. We were thinking of the family, Sarah suddenly cried, lifting her tear-stained face. Of our future, of stability. You were thinking of a lake house and a sports car dealership. I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. Don't dress your avarice in the clothes of family concern. I saw through it. I heard you, that night in the kitchen. The old man's just sitting here, waiting to die. I heard every single word. The color drained completely from Sarah's face. She looked at Mark, a silent accusation in her eyes. The secret was out. Their true selves had been exposed. Kyle finally found his voice again, a roar of pure, unadulterated betrayal. So what now, huh? What's the grand plan? We get this travel blog. He snatched the journal back from Mark and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor, its pages splaying open. And we get a house that belongs to the bank. You've left us with nothing. You've destroyed our family. No, Kyle, I said, my energy suddenly spent. The fury was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. You did that. You and your sense of entitlement. You did that long before I signed any papers. I just made sure you couldn't profit from it. The finality in my voice seemed to break something in him. The anger dissolved, and for a fleeting second, I saw the little boy he used to be, lost and scared. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold, hard emptiness. Get out, I said softly. They all stared at me. Get out of my house, I repeated, putting all the authority I had left into the words. It is still my house until I die, and I want you out. Mark was the first to move. He walked to Sarah, took her by the arm, and pulled her to her feet. She was limp, broken. He didn't look at me as he guided her toward the door. Kyle stood his ground for a moment longer, his chest heaving. He looked at the scattered journal, at the ransacked room, at me. I hate you, he said, the words simple, clean, and absolute. I will never forgive you for this. I know, I said. And then he turned and followed the others out. The front door clicked shut behind them. The silence they left behind was deafening. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, listening to the sound of my own heart. It was over. The battle was won. I had protected what? My pride, my sense of justice. I looked around the ravaged room. I had scorched the earth, and in doing so, I had destroyed any last chance of a relationship with my children. The victory felt ashen in my mouth. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked over to where my journal lay. I bent down, a painful, slow process, and picked it up. I smoothed the crumpled pages, my fingers tracing the words I'd written in Paris, in Venice, in Kyoto. The proof of my life, the testament to my rebellion. It was all I had left. A week passed. The silence in the house was absolute. The phone didn't ring. No one came to visit. I was a king in a ruined castle. I started getting the house back in order, not for them, but for myself. I restocked the bookshelves. I righted the globe, tracing the gash on Kenya with my finger. I was trying to reassemble the pieces of my life, but they didn't fit together the same way anymore. And then the letter came. It was from a law firm, Sloan and Prentice. It wasn't my law firm. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore it open. It was a single, crisp page. Dear Mr. Colby, we represent your children, Sarah Evans and Kyle Colby. It is with great regret that we must inform you of their intent to file a lawsuit against you for financial exploitation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They allege that you, while potentially of unsound mind, were unduly influenced by parties unknown to squander the family's inheritance, an asset in which they held a vested interest. Furthermore, they are seeking a temporary conservatorship over your person and your remaining finances, citing your reckless and irrational behavior as evidence that you are no longer capable of managing your own affairs. We strongly advise you to seek legal counsel. The words blurred on the page, a lawsuit, conservatorship. They weren't just walking away. They were fighting back. They were going to try to have me declared senile, to strip me of the last vestiges of my autonomy. They were going to lock me away in a home, control whatever pittance of money might be left, and probably try to contest the reverse mortgage. This wasn't just a skirmish anymore. This was all-out war. I felt a cold dread, but beneath it, a fresh spark of that old familiar fire. They thought I was a feeble old man they could push around. They thought the gray ghost had no fight left. I slowly, deliberately, folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. I walked to my desk, sat down, and pulled out a fresh piece of paper. I had one more move to make, one last card to play. I picked up my pen, my hand steady as a rock. It was time to write my will. A lawsuit, they were suing me, their own father. The words from that lawyer's letter were burned onto the back of my eyelids every time I blinked. Financial exploitation, unsound mind, conservatorship. They were the most insulting, the most vicious words they could have chosen. They weren't just trying to punish me, they were trying to erase me. To have a judge declare that I was no longer a person but a problem to be managed. The calm I'd felt after their confrontation shattered like glass. In its place was a cold, relentless fear that coiled in my stomach and tightened around my chest at 3 in the morning. This was their masterstroke. If they could get a conservatorship, it wouldn't matter what I'd done with the money. They would control me. They could drag me to doctors who would list my travels as mania and my revenge as paranoia. They could lock me in a sterile room somewhere and let the house go to the bank while they fought it. And I, the key witness in my own defense, would be deemed too incompetent to testify. I sat at my desk, the same desk Mark had defiled, and I stared at that single piece of blank paper. My will. What was the point? To leave them the journal, a symbolic gesture, but it wouldn't stop the legal machine they had set in motion. No, a will wasn't enough. I needed a weapon. That's when I thought of Michael Rossi. Michael had been Alina's lawyer for 40 years. He handled her father's estate, drawn up our own wills years ago. He was a bulldog in a 3-piece suit, old school, and he had loved my wife like a daughter. He was also the only person outside of this house who had ever looked at Mark and Kyle with a skeptical eye. At Alina's funeral, he'd pulled me aside, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Kobe," he'd said, his voice low and gravelly. "This is when you see people's true colors. You watch yours. And you call me if you need to." I needed to. His office was downtown, in a building that smelled of old wood and polished brass. He didn't look surprised to see me when his secretary showed me in. He just looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, took in the tension in my shoulders, and gestured to the leather chair opposite his colossal desk. "Kobe," he said, "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you. I heard through the grapevine that Sloan and Prentice sent you a letter." The legal world was a small town. "They did," I said, my voice rough. I slid the copy I'd made across the desk to him. He read it slowly, his expression not changing. When he finished, he placed it neatly on the blotter, took off his glasses, and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Financial exploitation. That's rich. And a conservatorship. They're playing hardball. They're trying to have me declared senile, Michael," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Because I spent my own money." "Tell me everything," he said, leaning back in his chair. "From the beginning, don't leave a single thing out." And so I did. I told him about the kitchen conversation, about the reverse mortgage, about Paris, Venice, Kyoto, the Sahara, the safari. I showed him my journal. I held nothing back. I told him about the confrontation, their rage, Kyle's hatred, Sarah's tears, Mark's cold calculation. I spoke for over an hour, and he listened, never interrupting, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the office was silent. Michael leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Okay," he said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a general who has just seen the enemy's battle plans. "Okay, this is what we're going to do. First, we're going to file a motion to dismiss this frivolous lawsuit with prejudice. Then, we're going to countersue." "Countersue?" I asked, bewildered. "For what?" "For intentional infliction of emotional distress, for one," he said, his eyes gleaming. "For breach of fiduciary duty. They had no right to break into your home and rifle through your private financial documents. But most importantly, we're going to sue for defamation." "Defamation?" "They are publicly alleging you are of unsound mind, Kobe. That is a direct attack on your reputation. It's libel per se, and we are going to make them eat it. He tapped a finger on my journal. This is not the diary of an unsound mind. This is the diary of a man who is painfully, lucidly sane. A man who made a conscious, deliberate choice. A judge will see that. A jury will see that. A flicker of hope, the first I'd felt in days, sparked in my chest. What do you need from me? I need you to be ready to testify, to get on that stand and tell the story you just told me. Can you do that? I thought of facing them in a courtroom, of looking my children in the eye and dismantling their lives under oath. The thought made me feel sick, but the thought of them winning, of them locking me away and rewriting my story, made me feel even worse. Yes, I said, my voice firm. I can do that. Good, Michael said. Now go home, let me do my job, and Kobe, don't talk to them, don't answer the phone. If they show up at your door, don't let them in. You are a fortress now, and I am your gatekeeper. The next few months were a strange, suspended animation. I followed Michael's orders. I became a fortress. The phone would ring Sarah's number, then Kyle. Then unknown numbers I was sure were from their lawyers, and I would let it go to voicemail. Their messages started pleading, then became angry, then finally desperate. Dad, please, we need to talk about this. We can drop the lawsuit, we can work this out as a family. Sarah's voice, thick with tears. You're going to regret this, old man. You're ruining everything. Kyle spitting venom. Then a new voice, smooth and professional. Mr. Kobe, this is Robert Sloan. I'm representing your children. We'd like to discuss a potential settlement before this goes any further. I deleted them all. Michael had warned me they would try to get me to talk, to trap me into saying something they could use. Silence is your shield, he'd said. Meanwhile, the legal documents began to fly. Thick envelopes arrived daily. Michael's motions, their responses. The language was dense legalese, but the intent was clear. They were trying to paint me as a doddering fool, and Michael was painting them as vultures. He had depositions scheduled. He was going to depose Sarah, Kyle, and Mark. He told me it would be brutal. He was going to tear their family concern argument to shreds. The day of the depositions arrived. I wasn't allowed to be there, but Michael called me that evening. He sounded tired but satisfied. Well, he said, that was enlightening. Sarah broke down almost immediately. She admitted to the kitchen conversation, said it was taken out of context, but she admitted it happened. She couldn't explain how talking about her father waiting to die was taken out of context. My heart ached for her, even now. The little girl in the pretty dresses. Kyle, I asked. Kyle was a disaster, Michael said, a note of triumph in his voice. He lost his temper. He called you a selfish bastard on the record. He admitted that he referred to the house as startup capital. The opposing counsel, Sloan, almost had an aneurysm trying to shut him up. It was perfect. And Mark was cool, calculated. He stuck to his story about being concerned for your mental well-being, but he couldn't explain away the break-in. He tried to call it a welfare check, but when I produced the invoice from the locksmith he hired, he had no answer. He's the smart one, Kobe. He knows they're losing. A pretrial hearing was set. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Albright, would hear arguments on the motion to dismiss the conservatorship. This was the first battle. The war would be the lawsuit itself, but if we could stop the conservatorship here, it would be a massive victory. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to Aliner's funeral. It hung looser on me now. I looked at myself in the mirror, an old man, a tired old man. But my eyes had a fire in them that hadn't been there a year ago. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, all dark wood and solemn silence, and they were all there. Sarah, Kyle, Mark with their lawyer, Robert Sloan, a man with a too-perfect tan and a smug expression that I immediately wanted to wipe off his face. They didn't look at me. We sat on opposite sides of the aisle. The chasm between us felt wider than the ocean I'd crossed. Judge Albright entered, and we all rose. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a demeanor that tolerated no nonsense. She listened as Sloane made his argument. He talked about my baffling and reckless financial decisions, my secretive travels, my hostility towards my loving children. He painted a picture of a confused old man being taken advantage of by a predatory bank, and of children just trying to protect their father from himself. Then it was Michael's turn. He stood up, slow and deliberate. He didn't even look at his notes. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonating in the quiet room. "This is not a case about an unsound mind. This is a case about unsound hearts. The hearts of children who saw their father not as a person, but as a placeholder for an inheritance." He walked over to our table and picked up my journal. "This, Your Honor, is the key to this case. This is not the ranting of a lunatic. It is a meticulously kept record. A record of a man rediscovering life after the loss of his wife. A man using the assets he spent a lifetime building to find peace and beauty in his final years." He opened it to a random page and read aloud. His voice, usually so gruff, was surprisingly gentle. "The stars in the desert are like nothing I've ever seen. No city lights to dim them. They are a blanket of diamonds so close I feel I could reach up and run them through my fingers. I thought of Ellie, of how she loved to stargaze from our backyard. The same stars, but here they are louder. They tell older stories. I felt small, insignificant, and for the first time in years that felt like a comfort, not a curse." Michael looked up at the judge. "Does that sound like the writing of a man who doesn't understand his actions? Or does it sound like the writing of a man who understands his mortality all too well?" He placed the journal back on the table. "The petitioners would have you believe my client is incompetent. The evidence shows he is all too competent. He heard his children planning their future on the foundation of his corpse, and he decided he would not be their foundation. He decided to be a man for whatever time he has left. That is not a symptom of dementia, Your Honor. That is a symptom of being human." He turned and pointed a finger at Sarah, Kyle, and Mark. "They are the ones who need a lesson in sound mind. They broke into his home. They rummaged through his private affairs. They are now attempting to use the court system to finish the job they started, to strip him of his dignity and his freedom because he spent his money in a way they didn't approve of. This conservatorship is not about protection. It is about punishment, and it is about control. I urge you to deny this motion and dismiss this charade." He sat down. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Albright looked from Michael to Sloane, then to me, then to my children. Her expression was unreadable. She adjusted her glasses. "The motion for a temporary conservatorship is denied," she said, her voice crisp and final. "The petition reeks of opportunism. The lawsuit for financial exploitation and emotional distress will proceed to trial, but I am issuing a preliminary injunction barring the petitioners from any contact with Mr. Kobe outside of these legal proceedings. This court is not a tool for familial strong-arming. We are adjourned." She slammed her gavel. The sound echoed in the stunned silence. It was over. The conservatorship was dead. We had won the first and most important battle. I felt a wave of dizzying relief. I looked over at my children. Sarah was sobbing openly into her hands. Kyle was staring straight ahead, his face a mask of thunderous fury. Mark was already whispering furiously to a pale-faced Robert Sloane. And then Kyle's eyes met mine. There was no hatred left in them. There was nothing. It was a void, an emptiness more terrifying than any rage. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, a piece of furniture, a ghost. He stood up, turned, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. Sarah, helped by Mark, followed him, her shoulders shaking. They were gone. Michael put a hand on my arm. "You okay, Kobe?" I nodded, unable to speak. The victory felt hollow. I had wanted justice. I had wanted to shock them, to hurt them as they had hurt me. But seeing my daughter's complete collapse and my son's utter nullification, it felt less like a victory and more like a mutual annihilation. We had a trial still looming, but Michael was confident. "They'll settle now. he said as we walked out of the courthouse. They have no case. The judge just told them as much. They'll want to avoid a public trial where all of this, he gestured with the journal, comes out. He was right. A week later, the offer came. They would drop the lawsuit with prejudice. They would sign a legally binding agreement never to contest my will or the reverse mortgage agreement. In return, we would drop the countersuit. It was over, truly over. I agreed. I was tired. The fire was gone. I was just an old man in a quiet house. The signed papers arrived. I stored them with the reverse mortgage documents. The house was still the bank. I was still its ghost. But now the other ghosts were gone for good. The seasons changed. Fall came, then winter. The house was colder, emptier than ever. I tried to read, to watch TV, to find joy in the small routines of my life. But the silence was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. I had won my war, but I was the only one left on the battlefield. I found myself thinking of Alina constantly. I talked to her portrait. Did I do the right thing, Ellie? Was this your justice? The portrait, of course, gave no answer. Her smile was forever gentle, forever ambiguous. One afternoon, as a light snow began to fall, coating the overgrown garden in a blanket of white, the doorbell rang. It was the first time it had rung in months, outside of delivery men. My heart hammered with a foolish, treacherous hope. Had one of them come back? Had Sarah? I opened the door. It was Sarah. It was a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. "Grandpa Kobe," she said. And then I saw it. She had her grandmother's eyes, Alina's eyes. "Lily," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Lily, Sarah's daughter, my granddaughter. She lived across the country, a graphic artist in Seattle. We exchanged Christmas cards, the occasional email. She'd been the quiet, artistic one, never drawn into the financial dramas of her parents. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside, wordlessly, and she entered. She didn't look around at the house with a calculating eye. She just looked at me. I heard what happened," she said softly, standing in the middle of the living room. "Mom told me her version. It was a lot." "I bet it was," I said, my guard up, waiting for the recrimination. But it didn't come. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. "I brought you this." Bewildered, I took it and unwrapped it. It was a book, a beautiful, blank, leather-bound journal, identical to the one I had filled. "I don't understand," I said. "Mom told me about your journal," she said, her gaze steady and clear. "About the travels, about everything. She meant it as a story of your betrayal. But I read the excerpts they quoted in the legal papers, the one about the desert stars." She paused and her eyes glistened. "I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever read. I thought that's the grandfather I never knew, the one who saw the world like an artist, not an accountant." I felt a lump rise in my throat, so large I couldn't speak. "I'm not here for anything, Grandpa," she said, her voice firm. "I don't want anything from you. I wanted to meet you, the real you. And I wanted to give you a new journal, because the story isn't over yet." I looked at this young woman, this stranger, with my wife's eyes, and I felt the ice around my heart, the ice I had cultivated so carefully, begin to crack. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down my wrinkled cheek. She stayed for tea. We talked for hours, not about the lawsuit or the money or the betrayal. We talked about art, about light, about her life in Seattle, about Alina. She asked about the travels, not with greed, but with a genuine wonder. What did the sand in the Sahara really feel like? Was the food in Kyoto as amazing as they say? For the first time in years, I was talking to a member of my family who saw me as a person, not a portfolio. When she left, promising to visit again soon, the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt waiting. I sat in my armchair, the new blank journal in my lap. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool leather. Lily was right. The story wasn't over. I had spent a fortune running from my life, buying experiences to prove I was still alive. I had crafted a masterpiece of revenge, a symphony of spite. I had won. I had driven my children away and secured my lonely, Pyrrhic victory. But as I sat there, watching the snow fall gently on the garden, I realized the final, bitter twist in my own tale. The revenge I had so meticulously planned, the justice I had so fiercely demanded, had left me with exactly what they'd wanted me to have: an empty house and a silence that would now last forever. I had become the ghost they always thought I was. And the only one who could see me was a girl who had just given me a new page to write on. I picked up a pen, the old one, the one I'd used to chronicle my revenge. I opened the new journal to the first, pristine page. I paused, the nib hovering over the whiteness. What story would I tell now? The snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of the past, inviting a new, uncertain path. The pen met the paper, and I began to write.